This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Tess Terrible in for Catherine Shen. In 2022, Matt Podolsky and his mother set out to hike the entire Appalachian Trail. He documented this 2,000-plus mile trip in his podcast, Common Land. Today, we'll be listening to Roadblocks. It's episode 8 of the podcast and recounts his hike along the Connecticut section of the Appalachian Trail. Matt will be joining us later on the show, but first, let's take a listen to Common Land.
There's no good story.
Yeah.
I was just walking up a rock and all of a sudden felt pain. I wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary at all.
Yeah. I'm Matt Podolsky, and that's my mom, Candy Podolsky. 1,500 miles into our attempt to through hike the entire Appalachian Trail, she got hurt.
I have way better stories to tell about the trail than the injury. I mean, I didn't think it was really a big deal. I thought I was being neurotic when I said I had to have it checked out. I didn't expect this.
Yeah.
Did not see it coming.
My mom had partially torn her Achilles tendon, a relatively common injury for long-distance hikers. She had sustained the injury a week or two earlier while hiking up a steep incline in New York.
And I remember thinking, oh God, whatever this is, I hope it holds. And it did, and I got up there. So I kind of could feel that I hadn't completely torn something.
Right.
But then it got better. So I thought, oh no, I just didn't tear anything at all. It was fine.
Yeah.
I was doing 20-mile days. I did like a 19-mile day. I did a 20-mile day. I was hiking faster than some of the younger people. Not many. Most of them are faster than me, but I was passing some, and I felt strong and great, you know. I was starting to get to that point where I was seeing the end, like I was ready to see the end, and I was starting to see the end, but not in a bad way. Oh well, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
Finish hiking it next year and support you this year. That's what I'm going to do.
There's definitely a part of me that wants to just be like, well, if you're not hiking, then I'm not going to hike, and I'll just hike whenever you're ready. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I was conflicted. A big part of me wanted to keep going, but I wasn't yet ready to give up on the idea of completing my through hike with my mom.
Yeah, I think you have to finish it.
I don't think I could like turn around and take another 2 months off next year, you know?
I know.
3/4 of the folks who attempt an Appalachian Trail through hike drop out before they finish. Lots of people quit early on in the hike when they first start to understand the rigors of long-distance hiking. But my mom had shown enormous grit and determination in the first stages of our hike, proving that she could overcome a serious knee injury and undertake a remarkable physical challenge at age 66.
I feel like I accomplished something pretty monumental.
Yeah.
Even if I weren't ever to do another hike again, I hiked almost 1,500 miles.
Yeah.
That's saying something.
It's true.
You know.
My mom would have to stay off trail for at least 3 weeks, possibly more. I decided to keep hiking, but soon I would face a physical challenge of my own. Oh gosh, I don't feel fantastic. And I would soon learn about another physical barrier from the Appalachian Trail's past, a dispute that almost forced a closure of a key section of the trail. Nobody's told me about any Native American reservation that the trail actually passes through. This is Common Land, a show about the Appalachian Trail. In this episode, we explore some of the physical barriers that stop Appalachian Trail through hikers in their tracks. I'm up on Schaghticoke Mountain. I believe that's how it's pronounced. I'm not 100% sure. Schaghticoke. The correct pronunciation is Schaghticoke, and I'm sorry in advance because you're going to have to hear me mispronounce it in my field tape quite a bit. Just a few hours previous, my mom had decided to get off trail. I now stood alongside a physical barrier to the Appalachian Trail that most hikers probably don't know about, the Schaghticoke Reservation. So last night at our campsite right along 10 Mile River, just a few miles from here, I was just looking at the map, trying to plan out today's hike, and I noticed that there was something labeled the Scatucook Reservation. Luckily, I had phone service last night and did a little bit of research, and it turns out that it was one of the very first Native American reservations established in North America. It was actually established before the United States came into existence.
We are an Indian tribe that has been here in the state of Connecticut for well over 300 years.
That's Chief Velke, who's served as the chief of the Scatucook Tribal Nation since 1987. Velke and I exchanged emails but weren't able to connect for an interview. The audio you just heard was from a 2018 interview recorded for a YouTube series called Street Talk.
We're located, as you indicated, in Kent, Connecticut, and we bordered New York to the west and the Housatonic River to the east. And our land consists now of approximately 400 acres. At one time it was well over 2,400 acres, but over the years it has dwindled down now to 400. Even being 400 acres, we're still the largest reservation here in the state of Connecticut.
The Appalachian Trail was routed through the Scatucook Reservation right from the beginning, starting in 1937. Although there was no formal agreement, the Scatucooks' relationship with the Appalachian Trail didn't sour until 1978, when representatives from the National Park Service started buying up all the land surrounding the trail. The Scatucooks were not going to sell. Instead, they filed a federal lawsuit in 1985. One of the fascinating things that I learned as I was doing a little bit of research last night is that there actually has been some dispute over the Appalachian Trail passing through the Scatucook Reservation. That lawsuit was dismissed by the judge, but the Scatucook Tribal Nation wasn't done fighting. By the year 2000, Chief Velke was in the midst of a decades-long battle to petition the United States government for federal recognition. Although they have been recognized by the state of Connecticut since before the American Revolution, they still weren't acknowledged as a federally recognized tribe. So in June of the year 2000, Velke announced that the Scatucook Tribal Nation would be temporarily closing the portion of the Appalachian Trail that passed through their land as a way to protest the federal government's inaction in granting the tribe federally recognized status. The protest was canceled at the last minute when Connecticut Attorney General Richard Blumenthal agreed to meet with Velke and discuss his concerns. 4 years later, the Scatucook Tribal Nation gained federal recognition, only to have their recognition rescinded just a year later.
So they fought tooth and nail in 2003 to 2005 to get us overturned, and they were successful. The state of Connecticut was successful in having our positive determination reversed into a negative. And the main reason why this took place was because the state of Connecticut did not want a third casino in the state.
So the presence of the Appalachian Trail on this reservation was being used by the Scatucook Tribal Nation in the early 2000s as leverage in their battle to gain federal recognition. Well, I'm walking on the Appalachian Trail here, right along the border of Connecticut and New York, and came across this little sign posted along the trail that says Scatucook Mountain AT relocation. The next 1.4 miles of the AT have been relocated to provide a permanently protected trail. The relocation runs northbound from just south of the New York-Connecticut state line to just north of the Scatucook campsite. So yeah, the old trail has been totally covered by logs and branches so that it's basically impassable. So nobody will take that section of the trail and walk through the reservation.
We did a relatively large relocation to take the AT off of Scotticook Indian Reservation land in Kent, Connecticut.
That's Dave Boone, the chair of the Trails Committee for the Connecticut chapter of the Appalachian Mountain Club.
The tribe was seeking federal recognition. They've been trying that for decades to get that recognition. And with the trail on their reservation land, they were still, have the ability to say, we don't want this anymore, and then we would really be stuck. So the Park Service was very helpful. We had a number of reviews of botanical, environmental, and an important one, because it's so close to the reservation land, was a cultural assessment done by Park Service archaeologists. And we had the opportunity to go up there with tribal members. And to me, it was a real eye-opener, because there were things going back thousands of years that were cultural structures or items to them. To me, it might look like a pile of rock, but to these people who know what it means and what it implies, that was a real eye-opener for me to have that experience and be with those folks as they were looking at these things. So I think we finished that in 2021.
So after decades of contention between the Scotticook tribal nation and the AT, the trail was finally rerouted around the reservation just the year before I hiked through in 2022.
But I think that over the years, we've made real progress and have a much stronger relationship with the tribe. And I think a lot of it is due to the work during that relocation and meeting face to face and, walking the relocation with tribal members. And I would think that went a long way to help appreciate each other. The relocation worked out great for everyone. Honestly, I think the tribe was glad to have the AT off their land.
I mean, it's also interesting that they put a map on the sign and the reservation is not labeled on the map.
There are lots of signs and historical markers along the Appalachian Trail. You can learn about Civil War battles while hiking through Maryland and about the history of the Park Service while hiking through the Smoky Mountains. But as several of our guests have pointed out, other aspects of American history don't get as much attention. So when I reached this point in the trail, I was keenly aware of the lack of information that was provided about the Scotticook Reservation.
We didn't put any signs up regarding why the relocation was done or mention of the tribe. But I don't think that was intentional. I don't think was our priority, really. I think Connecticut is surprising to people because you do have a sense that you're crossing into something different than you've hiked in the South. You're crossing into something that's Yankee in New England. And the landscape the AT crosses in Connecticut does suggest what's up ahead as you continue on north.
Walking alongside a gorgeous creek, really clear water, moss-covered rocks. It's beautiful. Ferns in the understory. I've got had a hermit thrush singing and a winter wren just a second ago.
As I approached Massachusetts, the state where I grew up, I could feel the difference that Dave was talking about. But that good feeling was about to end.
I woke up this morning and just didn't feel good. I think I definitely had a low fever this morning and just kind of that scratchy feeling in the back of my throat, like I was about to get a sore throat. And I just felt and still feel very lethargic.
I had crossed the border from Connecticut into Massachusetts just a few days ago, and I spent the previous day in town. So when I woke up in the morning feeling feverish, I
bought a COVID test. The result was negative, which is good. So I decided that I would keep walking today just for half the day and just make it a nice, easy day. So I'm not sure how many miles I'm going to get in, but I will be moving pretty slowly today. It's sort of sinking in, I guess, that it's possible that the rest of this hike for me is going to be a solo hike. And oh gosh, it sucks that I feel like right now. Yeah, this is definitely the lowest point on the hike. Before my mom's injury, and before I started to feel sick, I just had this kind of an assumption ingrained in my head that, like, we were going to make it, right? That we had sort of met each hurdle and gotten past it successfully. And then this situation just kind of took both of us by surprise, both me and my mom. And now I really understand how people could make it this far and drop out and give up. Because even though I've done the majority of the trail, I know that the hardest sections of the trail are ahead of me. Just the fact that I feel like right now just makes that feel really daunting. But, you know, I don't know what else to do other than to just keep walking. I came very close to just staying in the hotel another day or two. But when that COVID test came back negative, I felt like I just had to keep walking, even if I didn't make it very far. Hopefully that's not a mistake. Hopefully this doesn't get worse.
It did get worse, unfortunately. I spent the next 2 days on trail feverish and barely able to swallow any food. I was increasingly lethargic. Every mile was a struggle. So when my sister and her family came to pick me up for a planned weekend break, I asked them to take me to the nearest urgent care.
And sure enough, I went into the urgent care, and after I explained my symptoms and explained that I'd been hiking on the Appalachian Trail, she told me it was almost certainly tick-borne illness.
You know, if you grow up here, you inevitably know somebody who is at some stage of having just had Lyme disease or has, like, you know, arthritis problems that they associate with Lyme disease. And so these stories are kind of in the ether, even if you've never encountered it directly.
That's Taylor Quimby, a producer at New Hampshire Public Radio and my collaborator on this series. Taylor produced a radio and podcast series called Patient Zero, which took a deep dive into the world of Lyme disease.
Anybody who knows anything about Lyme disease knows that, like, it's a can of worms. And it can be kind of intimidating, actually, because there are people with, like, very passionate stances on a variety of sides that do not, you know, that don't jive well together.
Taylor's series, Patient Zero, explored the origins of Lyme disease, a story that begins with a woman named
Polly Murray. She was this person who, you know, through really dogged determination and in the face of a lot of dismissal from people in the medical community, really persevered and pushed this issue forward. She was living in Lyme, Connecticut. So this is, of course, where Lyme comes from, the name of the disease. And she has 4 kids. She was there with her husband. They all basically started to have this constellation of symptoms, things that we would recognize now, you know, swollen joints, aches and pains, fatigue. And, you know, saw a number of doctors who really said, you know, basically, you're just depressed, Polly. Like, this isn't a real thing. And ultimately, against the advice of her family doctor, she ended up calling the Connecticut State Health Authorities and got connected with a doctor by the name of Dr. Alan Steer. And then the two of them kind of collaborated. She was able to bring her notes and give all of the information she had gathered to him. He and a number of other people, obviously I'm like condensing a lot of history here, went on to do the initial investigations that kind of outlined what then was called Lyme arthritis.
Those first cases of Lyme disease, then known as Lyme arthritis, occurred in the 1970s. Since then, Lyme has exploded across the northeastern U.S. and beyond, causing disruption and controversy in the healthcare system.
Because it's so important to start treatment for Lyme with antibiotics right away before the disease progresses, they prescribed those antibiotics immediately, the doxycycline or whatever it is.
This is one of the most important things to know about Lyme disease. Without immediate treatment with antibiotics, people who contract Lyme disease can wind up with debilitating symptoms that last for months or years. I was extremely lucky to have seen a doctor that recognized the importance of getting me on antibiotics immediately. Many, many others haven't been so lucky.
Doctors want an objective measure. So if you have a very well-defined rash that fits the sort of Lyme stereotype, right off the bat, again, you will almost certainly get diagnosed correctly if you are, in one of these New England states, for example. But not all rashes look exactly the same. And in fact, some people don't get any rashes at all. I think a big piece of, talking about bias, when I did this story initially, I remember the CDC website, it was all white skin.
The healthcare system is riddled with biases, especially when it comes to Lyme disease. In addition to biases based on skin color, there are also geographic biases. In areas where Lyme disease is less common, patients are less likely to be diagnosed correctly. And this bias is complicated by the fact that Lyme is on the move. The disease has been expanding into new environments since the 70s, driven by a number of factors.
Development is a huge, huge piece of the puzzle here. When you take a big patch of forest and you start cutting cul-de-sac after cul-de-sac into these wooded areas, those are spaces that white-footed mice absolutely love. And those mice are a huge, huge part of the life cycle for these ticks that spread Lyme disease.
Development into wooded areas also increases the likelihood that you'll wind up picking up ticks, not just on a hike, but in your backyard. But it isn't just development that is driving changes in the spread and prevalence of Lyme. Climate change is playing an outsized role.
You've been seeing a real measurable rise in Lyme rates in southern parts of Canada, where previously weather conditions were just not great for ticks. We see how the world is changing because of climate change. We can make guesses about what that's going to mean for Lyme disease and other tick-borne illness. We have these different ways of trying to intervene, but all of them have pros and cons, and in many cases are just not as effective as we'd like. And then so much of it seems to come back down to our own behavior and the idea that, we could really use a vaccine, and you got to put your socks over your pants.
It's day 2 of hiking after starting to take the antibiotics for Lyme disease. And I must say, I feel significantly better than I did yesterday. So just that one pill I took yesterday, I think, is certainly doing something. It's just a lot less lethargic in the morning. It was a lot easier to motivate myself to get up and pack up all my gear and start hiking. Definitely gonna take it easy for these next few days and hope that I continue to feel better. I'm certainly not gonna start pushing big miles again until I'm back to 100%.
Despite my slow pace as I continued my hike through Massachusetts, I was rapidly approaching a key milestone of my hike.
All right, well, it's August 2nd. I'm in Cheshire, Massachusetts, which is the town where I started my first long hike 19 years ago, which means that I just hiked the last mile of the AT. I've hiked every single mile of the trail.
In the summer of 2003, after my freshman year of college, I convinced two of my friends to join me on a 600-mile-long backpacking trip. We began our trip in Cheshire, Mass., climbing Mount Greylock, and finished at Katahdin 2 months later. It was my first foray into the world of long-distance hiking, and it planted the seed of desire to thru-hike the entire trail.
Everything I do from here on out is a repeat. But, I'm not going to stop. I'm going to keep going and try to finish this thru hike. And I know how difficult these last 600 miles are. The antibiotics have definitely kicked in. I would not say I'm at 100% quite yet, but maybe 80. So I'm starting my hike up Mount Greylock, tallest peak in Massachusetts. I can't say it looks familiar yet.
By the time I reached Mount Greylock, just 3 days after being diagnosed with Lyme disease, I had discovered a new energy and motivation to hike. I was eager to enter northern New England, which I knew represented the most rugged and difficult terrain on the trail, but also some of the most spectacular scenery.
Very close to the summit of Lafayette Peak, the highest one on the Franconia Ridgeline.
In our next episode, we'll explore the unique history of trail building in these rugged mountains.
Where anybody can imagine they would want to go with a trail, suddenly you see them building that trail.
And I'll learn that just because my mom got off trail doesn't mean that I'm hiking alone.
My plan is to slow it down and savor every last minute of it and enjoy it and treat it as a vacation.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Where We Live. I'm Tess Terrible, in for Catherine Chen. You just heard episode 8 of the Common Land podcast second season. Coming up next, we speak with producer Matt Podolsky, all about his experience hiking the Appalachian Trail here in Connecticut. This is Where We Live. Stay with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Tess Terrible, in for Catherine Chen. More than 3 million people visit the Appalachian Trail each year, but fewer than 1,000 hikers finish the entire trail in a single year. Those that do are added to the roster of 2,000 milers. Matt Birdman Podolsky, producer of Common Land podcast, is one of those special few. He joins us now to discuss his experience. Matt, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So our listeners just heard your episode where you were hiking the 52.2 miles of the Connecticut Trail.
Yep.
But I want to go back a little bit. Tell me a little bit about how this all got started for you wanting to hike the Appalachian Trail. Do you have experience hiking? Tell me, let's go back to the very beginning.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I've been a hiker for most of my life. I grew up, like my parents were they were into camping. Like my parents got me outside, but I was really like I was the one motivating them to go backpacking. Like they had sort of limited experience, and I think they kind of dove into it because I was so eager and like really wanted to go on backpacking trips when I was a kid. And, that sort of developed to the point where, when I was in college, I read A Walk in the Woods by Bill Bryson. And that inspired me to read a few other books about, through hiking the Appalachian Trail. And the summer after my freshman year of college, I convinced a couple of friends to do a 600-mile section of the Appalachian Trail. And so that was kind of my introduction. I mean, I made every mistake you could possibly make. I was carrying way too much weight. I didn't have any of the right gear. I was wearing big, like big, heavy, all leather hiking boots that rubbed blisters everywhere on my feet. But despite that, like despite making every mistake you can imagine, like I was hooked, right? Like it was, I got this taste of the sort of through hiking culture. And I just loved the simplicity of like waking up every morning and knowing that you have like one responsibility, which is to get from point A to point B. Before doing that hike, it's the idea of through hiking the Appalachian Trail 2,200 miles seemed impossible, insurmountable, right? But after doing that small section of it, I was like, all right, like maybe someday I could do this. It put the idea in the back of my head. And then, 10 years went by, within that 10 years, I lost my dad to cancer. And when my dad was really sick, I went to my mom, and I was like, I think we should go on a long hike together, as like a way to sort of get past this loss. And she was 100% on board with this idea. So the two of us hiked the Long Trail in Vermont, end to end, which is 275 miles. It took us about a month to hike. And by the time we finished that hike, like my mom was hooked, right? Like she got that same kind of taste of the sort of long distance hiking culture and just the concept behind it. And she was totally hooked. And so like from that period on, like the two of us were sort of dead set on like someday we're going to find a moment to do a through hike of the Appalachian Trail, right? But it took us 6 months to do, right? It's a long adventure. It takes some time to sort of figure out how to put your life on pause for that amount of time. And we had originally planned on through hiking in 2020. And we backed out of our plan to through hike 3 days before our planned start date, because that was like when all of the closures were starting because of the pandemic. And 3 days before we were supposed to start, the Appalachian Trail Conservancy put out this notice, basically saying, telling through hikers to stay away, right? Like stay away from the trail. And so we backed out. We postponed it for another 2 years, and 2022 was our year.
So I'm curious, when you talk about your experience of losing your dad and deciding to do this with your mom, did you meet a lot of other people on the trail that had gone through something like that and it kind of inspired them to do this lifelong dream, or is it more of a spur of moment decision for people that decide to hit the trail?
Right. It really runs the gamut, right? I mean, like there's so many different motivations that people have for taking on an adventure of this scale. I certainly met other folks that were through hiking as a way to get past the loss of a loved one. So grief is, I wouldn't, it's maybe not the most common reason that people get out there, but it's definitely one of them. We definitely met other folks that were out there on the trail as a way to get past grief. There's a really common thread, that you see when you're out there through hiking of just general, like people hiking for mental health, just generally, right? You see lots of you see people, I remember really distinctly like seeing like a little bit of graffiti that a through hiker had written on like a trail sign. And what they wrote was, the Appalachian Trail equals free therapy.
I love that.
And that's always stuck with me, right? And you hear people talking about this all the time of like, whatever they're dealing with, the trail helps them get through it.
So you part of the Appalachian Trail does run through Connecticut, about 52 miles of free therapy, if you will. Can you tell our listeners who might not be familiar with what that just like bite of the trail looks like in Connecticut, what does the landscape look like? What was it like hiking through that very, I mean, in the span of 2,200 miles, that little bit of the trail?
I think the Connecticut section, the AT, is a really wonderful section, and I think people experience it differently, and folks experience different sections of the trail depending on like which direction they're hiking and sort of where they're at in their journey when they reach that section in Connecticut. Because I hiked south to north, which is the majority of folks that through hike start in the south and hike north, but there's a significant contingent that start at the northern terminus and hike south, and there's folks that like flip flop and like do a through hike but don't do it contiguously. So there's a whole range of experiences, and I think that colors the individual experience for each person. But for me, hiking south and heading north, like when I reached Connecticut, I grew up in Massachusetts, out in the Boston area, and so I grew up hiking in New England, in Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Vermont and Maine. And by the time, like when I got to Connecticut, I felt like I was home. It was the first time where I'm like, this landscape feels really familiar. Like these mountains feel like New England mountains. The trail isn't super rugged in Connecticut, but you get like a taste of the sort of more I guess the taller and more rugged mountains that hikers are going to experience further north as you get into Massachusetts and then Vermont, New Hampshire. So for me, it felt like a homecoming. You know what I mean? Like
Mm-hmm.
like the landscape really felt familiar, and it just sort of washed me in like all these memories of like hiking growing up as a kid. So that's that was the feeling I had. I remember having as I walked through that section.
Yeah. And so our listeners just heard, you going through Connecticut, and as we learned from the history that you explore in this episode, the trail actually used to pass through the Schaghticoke Reservation, but in 2021 it was rerouted. Was it significant to you that you were one of the first group of hikers that hiked this kind of new trail? Because something I've kind of noticed with trail hiking is that people are really particular about like the trails that they hike. And, you, especially with something as enormous as the AT, you want to hike all of it. You want to take every single step in that trail. It's almost like you collect it in a way.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think like my experience surrounding that section of the trail that, was rerouted around the Schaghticoke Reservation, it was sort of, and I kind of explained this a little bit in the episode, how I didn't know about that history. And like I said, in response to your previous question, like as I entered Connecticut, I felt like I was returning home. So there was this familiarity with the landscape that I hadn't experienced up until that point. And simultaneously, I learned about this bit of history that I had no idea about, right? And, I researched the history of the Appalachian Trail before I did this through hike, right? Like, I'm going to produce a podcast about it. Like, I'm going to learn everything there is to know about the Appalachian Trail, right? Trying to find interesting stories to tell in my podcast. And it just kind of blew me away that I found out about the reservation. Just kind of, it was a fluke, right? I just happened to be sort of looking at my map on my phone the night before, planning out the hike, and it just so happened that I had downloaded an old, outdated USGS map layer, right? So what I was looking at was like an old USGS map with the modern route of the trail overlaid as another layer on top of it. And so most people, when they're looking at that map, they don't have that layer. And so they just see the landscape and they see where the trail goes, right? But because I had that layer, I could see labeled on the map Schaghticoke Reservation, and I could see the original route of the trail on that USGS map and the updated route And sometimes those updates, so you don't always really know like what you're going to see until you get there. So I wasn't certain that, like where the trail was actually going to go, if it was going to go through the reservation or around it, until I actually got to that point. To me, it was just, it was curiosity, right? Was the overwhelming feeling of like, why, why did this reroute happen? And like the signage didn't explain why the reroute happened. It was really vague. And so it like all of my sort of like storytelling, alarms were going off of like, I need to figure out what happened here, right? Because this is like an interesting story and people aren't talking about this, right? The fact that, and so like subsequently after I got off trail, like I dug into the history, and I learned that, the trail was routed through the Schaghticoke Reservation right from the beginning, in the 1930s without permission, and that there was this history of, decades of contention between the Schaghticoke tribal nation and the Appalachian Trail Conservancy and the federal government. Like the Schaghticoke government had actually held, they were using the fact that the AT was on their land as leverage in their fight to gain federal recognition in the early 2000s. And I'm like, wow, so then it's like, okay, like now I understand why, certain entities like don't want to talk about this story, right? Right? Like it's not something that the Appalachian Trail Conservancy probably wants to promote. The fact that the trail was routed through a Native American reservation without permission, and that stood, for a long. It wasn't until 2021, the year before I hiked through, was one of the things that kind of blew my mind, that it took so long for them to reroute it, despite decades of contention. It was known for a very long time that the Schaghticokes did not want that trail passing through their land.
Did it cause any sort of conflict among those that were walking the trail that you know about? Because rerouting a trail like the AT, that seems like a really big deal. I've never heard of that happening in the history of the AT.
So actually, I mean, that brings up a really interesting point about the Appalachian Trail, which is that it's actually like reroutes are happening on a fairly consistent basis year after year. So each year, that class of through hikers, you're hiking a different trail every single year. Reroutes happen, like these days, reroutes aren't happening like all the time, all up and down the trail. But every year, there's always at least a handful of sections of the trail that have to get rerouted. There, in the past several years, there have been lots of reroutes because of extreme weather events. Hurricane Helene caused, like hundreds of miles of reroutes. And some of those sections of the trail, they've been able to like return them back to the sort of route that was established previously, but some of those sections are rerouted permanently. And one of the things that the Appalachian Trail Conservancy is doing, like they're planning large scale reroutes. They're looking into the future over like a sort of, long-ish time horizon and imagining like where they're going to have to reroute the trail long term because of climate change. And so they're looking, ATC right now is looking at sections of the trail that follow along stream corridors, and also sections of trail that follow along high ridge lines, because those are the most sensitive to extreme weather events. One of the things that I document in the podcast was like we sort of documented the history of like through hiking the AT, right? And the first person to through hike the AT was this guy Earl Schaefer, who through hiked in completed the first through hike of the trail in 1948. And Earl then hiked the trail 2 additional times. So he through hiked in 1948, and then he hiked again in, I think, the late 60s. And then he did a 50th anniversary hike. And he hiked it again when he was in his late 70s in 1998. Right. And he talks about, I went through a bunch of, interviews that were done with him after that 50th anniversary hike. And one of the things he talks about extensively is how he didn't recognize the trail. He's like, the trail it's not the same actual trail that he had hiked in 1948. So the trail is kind of like constantly changing. And, it has changed very dramatically since its inception. And because of climate change, it's inevitably the route will change very significantly and dramatically in the future.
With all the changes that have occurred on the trail, and you add on just a huge surge in interest in hiking that we've seen since the pandemic, I want you to end by giving any advice to someone maybe preparing to hike the trail, because it's really impossible not want to hike the trail after listening to your podcast.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky question, right? Because it's like the whole podcast is kind of about this balancing act that we're playing, right? Between access and overuse. And it's like we want, like I would advocate at any opportunity for increased access, right? Like I think the more people that get out and have this experience, like I think there's a dramatic benefit to society of people going through this experience, right? It's life-changing in a good way. It shifts your perspective on society, again, in a good way, in a way that I think is beneficial for how people function in our culture and society. But there is this concern about overuse. I think it's largely overblown. Like, I think that despite, like, I hiked in 2022, which is probably like the highest. I'd have to double check this, but it was, at the time in 2022, we were setting records for the number of thru hikers that were on the trail, right? It's 2 years removed from the pandemic. A lot of people had postponed their hikes, like us. But, despite being out there during a historic year where there were really, high numbers of people on the trail, I mean, I still spent most of my time hiking by myself, right? It's still, you still have a lot of alone time. It's a big trail, 2,200 miles is a lot. So you get plenty of alone time. But yeah, coming back to your question and thinking about like advice that I would give for folks, advice kind of falls into two categories, right? Like there's the sort of like technical advice of like physically, what should you do to make, to increase your chances of being successful if you're trying to thru hike. And the number one thing I would say is do whatever you can to reduce your pack weight. Your pack needs to be as light as possible. Like there's a direct relationship between the amount of fun, the amount of pleasure that you get out of the experience, and the weight of your pack. The heavier your pack is, the less fun you're going to have. Every ounce matters, right? It was my goal to get my base weight. So when we talk about base weight, we're talking about like the weight of your pack without any food or water. And my goal was for my base weight to be under 15 pounds, which is slightly ambitious, but like not impossible. You just got to really, find a way to hone in on the essentials. And there's, tons of like great advice out there in the world of ultralight backpacking as far as like gear lists and, ultralight gear that you can use and all that stuff. But the other piece to that, right, is like the sort of psychological advice. And you get out on the trail and it's sort of like universally understood that the challenge is 80% mental and 20% physical. I mean, it is an enormous physical challenge, but the people that quit, most of them are not quitting because of like physical issues or injuries. It is an enormous mental challenge. Like you just have to start to wrap your brain around what it's going to be like to just walk all day, every day for 6 months. And it's not for everybody, right? It's definitely not for everybody. And I think there's not, it's one of those things where it's like, there's all kinds of, training regimens that you could look up and that people will recommend. I knew, like I met lots of people that didn't do any training, any physical training at all, and just went, as you know, a number of people told me, like straight from the couch to the trail. And I knew people who did that and were successful, right? So if you're smart about it, like you can do that, right? But it's really about overcoming that mental challenge, and there's not really any way to replicate what it's like until you get out there.
Matt Podolsky, producer of Common Land podcast, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'm Tess Terrible. Today's show is produced by Isaac Moss. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thanks for listening. Happy hiking, everybody.